Welcome to class 2, that's a mistake there, of week 7 of the psychology of organizational development. Today we'll be talking about how to understand personality. We'll talk about what is personality from a few different perspectives. We can look at personality as type, as, are there different types of people in the world? Are you a certain kind of person? Am I a certain kind of type of person? Could look at personality as character. You can see it as a trait. So maybe something like extroversion is a trait that you could be high on that trait or in the middle of it, or you could be low on that trait. And we could even look at personality as a skill, which I think can be an adaptivistic perspective. And I'll go over some common personality models and measures, some of which you may encounter in the workplace. And I would also like to discuss these in the context of value judgments, because we live in a culture and we may assume that certain personality traits are better than others, but it takes all kinds to make a world. And sometimes that's not really the best way of doing things. And I'll go over a few that you'll see in the workplace, like the MBTI and the DISC assessment, which aren't really valid or reliable tools. And we can talk about the best way to approach those. Onwards, I have a writing exercise, a 2-minute writing exercise, and I plan to put it on the career development assignment. So, you could get it done right here, right now. So we're at, say we're 5:45, and I'll give you till 5:47, which should be 2 minutes, and just answer the question, free write. Find a piece of paper somewhere, grab your notebook, open a Word document, and just kind of answer the question, who are you? And I'll do it too. So I'll see you in 2 minutes. Give you about another minute. Okay. So, what did you get? Can you give me an example of the way you answered that question? Okay. So, so you have I am a woman, a person of color, from a certain location. This is interesting because you answered in a different way than I did. And, logical, bold. She likes structure. Like learning interesting things. Awesome. Any other answers? And you can speak up, or if you don't want to keep it private, you can put it in the chat because none of that comes through on a recording. Here's the way I answered it. We answered it in different ways because there's different ways of thinking about self. So things like being a woman or a person of color are about demographics. That's one way you can sort of think about yourself and think about other people. And from a certain place is like being a member of a certain community. And then these are traits, being logical or being bold. And then you have interests and values. So you value structure. You also like learning. So that's like a value too. But so we have interests and preferences. And what did I say when I answered this? I was thinking about a lot of social roles, like I am a teacher, I am a counselor, I'm a mother. Those are all social roles. I thought, I am 5'4". That's, what is that? It's not a demographic. It's a trait, but it's a physical trait. And these are physical traits too. I had some traits like I'm pretty disagreeable. I'm what I'm doing. Well, I'm working hard. And how I'm feeling. I'm feeling anxious, and I know that I'm looking forward to. I wrote to the lecture. I didn't mean this one. There's one on victim blaming. That's the Marshall Lecture on Public Philosophy that I'm looking forward to going tonight. And then again, another social role. I'm a vocational psychologist. So you see that there's really different ways that we can think of ourselves and that we can think of other people. And it's interesting that nobody said, I am an ENTP, or I score on the 90th percentile for extroversion, though that is the way that personality models would look at people. So psychology, well, what does that word mean? What is psychology? Well, think about its etymology and how many morphemes are in that world. It's psychology. Ology means the study of something. The study of what? What does the psych stand for? Well, it stands for psyche. And psyche refers to the human soul, mind, or spirit. And you could understand soul in a secular humanistic sense as the kernel of your unique individuality. One way we try to understand ourselves and other people is through the study of personality. And personality is defined as an individual's characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. And that sounds like something we already learned about. Remember, we learned about culture and norms, and norms are a group's characteristic ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Well, personalities is yours. And what's key to the idea of personality is it's supposed to be pretty stable across situations. The idea is that your personality is kind of the same today as it is next week, as it was last week, and that your personality goes with you into different situations. And in the classroom, at work, in all these places, I'm an extrovert. It is a bit context blind, though. We sort of assume that there's one general personality that goes everywhere, whereas in reality, sometimes there's different versions of ourselves. But let's say that you tested as really high on extrovert. You're a 90th percentile extrovert. Well, then I would expect that you'd be the kind of person that raises their hand in class, that chats up a lot of people at parties and is outgoing at a networking event. And I would expect to see that manifest pretty consistently in the things that you do and say. And I'd expect that in 20 years, you'll still be an extrovert. And I would guess that you were also an outgoing child, and maybe you were once a bubbly baby. That gets back to the idea of temperament. Temperament and personality aren't quite the same thing. Temperament is what you're born with. And when newborn babies come out of the womb, they actually do show differences in temperament. There's bubbly, kind of happy babies. There are cranky babies. There are calm, placid babies, and that is genetic. And biological. That's your temperament. And your personality has something to do with your temperament. It's definitely part of it, but your personality is also more than that. It's also about learned responses and about culture. But underlying your personality, there's a temperament, which is biological, which you probably showed since your first moments. But then, maybe people's temperaments can change. Things happen to you biologically. Let's say that you become ill, and could that change your temperament? Maybe it does. So how do we explain personality, and what are people like? Are there certain types of people? We've been trying to do this for a very, very long time. So can we divide people into groups that share certain qualities? Well, the ancient Greeks and Romans thought that there were about 12 different types of people. And they believed that your personality was determined by the arrangements of the stars and planets when you were born. And there are 12 of these constellations that they thought. So they thought there must be 12 different types of people. And when they looked at these constellations, they saw mythical beings in the patterns of the stars. Like, let's say, oh, this one looks like a crab, and that one looks like a ram, and this one looks like scales, could be the scales of justice. And maybe if you're born under the ram, you're a really sort of bold, aggressive, ram-like kind of person. And well, they thought that constellation there, the one called Libra, looked like a set of scales. But now that's the old-fashioned kind of scale, not the digital scale that you step on in the morning. And they believe that if you're born under that constellation, that then you'd be the sort of person who's concerned with attaining balance and harmony, peace, and justice in the world. Because you're born under the influence of that big heavenly set of scales. And scales are used to determine balance and justice and the impartial weighing of evidence. And you could see the role of symbolism and of culture there, because that's not what scales look like anymore. And, we don't look up into the heavens and say, oh, well, now it looks like a digital scale. And the connections between scales and justice is balancing different concerns or impartially weighing evidence, is totally metaphorical. So you could come up with other metaphors and symbols for justice. So how about a sword? Because you fight for it. People still use this system today, and they look to their star signs for guidance, to understand themselves, to understand others. And they ask the internet questions like, can a Leo date a Pisces? Shoppers Drug Mart is using it to sell perfume. So they say that someone with a fire sign like Leo has a fiery personality, and there's a specific scent that suits that personality. Now, here's an example of a personality description that I found on a New York Times website. and it's for a Virgo. It says that the Virgos are practical, hardworking, and analytical, immensely talented at assessing the details of any situation and finding solutions to problem solve them. They're natural-born organizers and value consistency, loyalty, and productivity. They invest very much of themselves into their goals and plans, but can become very critical if things do not develop as they had originally expected. This perfectionism is something that can grow into an obsession. However, because of their tenacity and intellectualism, they're usually able to create order out of chaos, no matter what. Ultimately, Virgos are kind, grounded, and trustworthy people, happy to help anyone they love who needs it. And the student says in the chat, I'm a Virgo, and I agree. And you know what's funny? I'm a Virgo too, and this is actually a pretty good, I kind of think it's a good description of me. But well, if I approach it kind of credulously and inclined to interpret it as true, I might have some confirmation bias, and I might really latch on to the statements that resonate with me and ignore or disregard the ones that don't. So I'm a Virgo, detail-oriented, analytical, and intellectual and critical, yes, but practical, hell no. I'm like the least practical person out there. I mean, have you seen my shoes? I value consistency and productivity, but I don't know about loyalty. Relationship's not working, maybe move on, I don't know. But I might just ignore that and overlook the parts of the description that don't work. And what if I were to count each one of those statements one by one? How many statements are there? Maybe there's 50. And what percent of them are true? Is it 100%? And when it says something like practical, hardworking, and analytical, for that to be true, does that mean that all three of them have to be true? Because for me, it's false because I'm not practical. But if it's what I counted as like a 2 out of 3, while this kind of a pretty decent description of my personality and the other student on the chat, I do know other people that are born around September who this description doesn't fit. And so your star sign could happen to be accurate for you. And now sometimes it can be the case that a statement is true for you because it's generally true for most people. And those vague statements are called Barnum statements. An example is when they say that the Virgos are happy to help anyone they love who needs it. Well, who isn't? And who isn't upset when their plans that they care about go awry? And as popular as they are, when they've done predictive research on star signs, the system has failed in empirical tests of prediction. And so as much as people love it, and as much as they can genuinely learn from it, it's not an empirically supported system. I think these descriptions can offer an authentic fit to the extent that they do describe real personality traits that occur in people. So the personality traits that are defined in the hexaco model are things that people have been picking up on for thousands of years. Those traits weren't just invented when the authors of the hexaco model wrote their paper in, I don't know what it was, 2010, right? Those traits were around before that. What Virgo gets at a lot is conscientiousness. And what does Libra get at? It gets at honesty and humility and maybe a dash of agreeableness. And we'll cover all those when we talk about the hexaco model. But my point is that if you are born around September and you also happen to be very conscientious, then you might really identify with this. Now, okay, that's one way we could look at personality. And I'm looking at this and thinking, gee, I think this slide is in the wrong place. So forgive me while I flip ahead. Yes, so there's another, here's another type model. So here's another type model, and it's the Holland model of vocational personality. And I'll talk more about this next class when we do the class on career. I'll have you take the test for the Holland model as well. This model proposes that there are 6 vocational types that seek out certain vocational environments. Maybe you are an intellectual that likes to be in the library, and that's the investigative type. Maybe you're a social creature that likes helping people, and you'd be happy as a teacher in a classroom or a nurse in a hospital. Maybe you are an entrepreneur and a leader that likes to be in the boardroom. Maybe you're a creative type of person that wants to be in a studio, maybe an art studio, maybe a music studio. Or maybe you're the kind of person that likes to get their hands dirty and you'd like to be in the engine room or the garage or the operating theater or the garden. Here's another personality type theory. And I think this is actually a bit more narrative. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I had some slides out of order. Forgive me. One of those days. Here is the personality type measure that you are most likely to see in the workplace. And it's the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator, the MBTI. And so it says, the theory would say that people are extroverts or they are introverts. And extroverts are energized by people. And they enjoy a variety of tasks, a quick pace, and they're good at multitasking. Interesting. That's notice how it's putting some other things in there. It's like extroverts like people, but where did multitasking come from? I'm noticing that as a point about validity. Then they say they're introverts. And they say that introverts like working alone or in small groups. They prefer more deliberate pace, and they like to focus on one task at a time. So I'll buy the introverts might enjoy their alone time. From what I know about personality, I'm seeing that they're lumping in this thing about focus that's not really about introversion from what I know about more validated personality theories. Then they say that there are sensors and intuitives. And they say that sensors are realistic people who like to focus on the facts and details and apply common sense and past experience to come up with practical solutions to problems. What they're getting at here is practicality. So the kind of person that likes to work in the garage or in the lab or out gardening. But they threw in something about focus on facts and details that it says more about conscientiousness. Okay, but for now, we have your practical down-to-earth sensors. And then they have the more lofty, abstract intuitives who like to focus on the big pictures and see patterns and like innovation and like to be creative. And this best corresponds to the idea of openness on the Big Five or the Hexaco. So some people might be interested in having a philosophical discussion or going to an art gallery and being like, wow, the amazing big ideas. And folks don't like that so much. Then they have the dimension of thinkers and feelers. And this gets at I think it most closely approximates agreeableness and disagreeableness from the Big Five or Hexaco. So they say that thinkers, that's your kind of logical kind. So I'm guessing that the student in the chat came up as a T when he did this. That's my guess. Anyway, they say that thinkers tend to make decisions using logical analysis, objectively weigh the pros and cons. They value honesty, consistency, and fairness. Thinking about this from a validated personality model, I see that they're doing two things in there. So they have the kind of fact-based objectivity. I don't care how this makes you feel. I'm going to speak the truth. That's kind of like disagreeableness versus the more pleasing, flexible, lenient, agreeable type. But when they say kind of valuing fairness, that's getting more into a different dimension that's kind of about ethics that in the Hexaco is called honesty, humility. So who are their feelers? Their feelers, they say, tend to be sensitive and cooperative, decide based on their values and how others will be affected by their actions. That's getting at agreeableness. So how could this make another person feel? How does it make me feel rather than, what is true? And I'm going to say that. And their fourth dimension is a muddy one, judges or perceivers, because again, they're throwing a couple of different personality traits in here. So they're saying that judges tend to be organized and prepared. They like to make and stick to plans, and they're comfortable following most rules. A lot of that is getting at the idea of conscientiousness. That's being organized, prepared, diligent. Making and sticking to plans. I mean, conscientiousness too. And then their perceivers are supposed to be more fluid and flexible. And they like to keep their options open. They like to be spontaneous, and they like to be flexible. And that is, I think, a kind of a positive spin on low conscientiousness, which is just seen in a really damning way in other personality models. So I think this is tapping into conscientiousness, but I also see a bit of openness in the perceiver and low openness in what they call the judgers. So when they're mixing up two things, that muddies the concept. And that this is one of the reasons why the MBTI is actually not a valid personality assessment, though it's out there and it can be kind of useful in its own way. So when you make these combinations, you end up with 16 types. So it says you're one of these types. And I'm wondering, did any of you guys find your type? You'll get a report like this. So I came up as sort of ENTP. You'll notice there's the A or the T. It says ENTP-A and ENTP-T. And that is an addition that's pretty new that I think gets at the idea that, or addresses the fact that this is missing one of the factors of the big five or the hexaco, that is sort of emotional stability or neuroticism. And they got at that as, I think, assertiveness versus turbulence. Again, it doesn't map onto the big five or hexaco factor that well, but I feel like that's what they were trying to add. Anyway, it's not a great theory and it's not a great instrument either. So the test is not very reliable. So just forget about whether or not the theory behind the test is a good theory. It's just a bad test. So you look at the question, well, you could be an extrovert and still not be regularly making new friends because you are extroverting yourself with the friends that you already have. So you could answer this in a way that doesn't align with the theory behind the test. What I notice happens when people take this test is that they usually end up with some 4 letters that are not the type that most resonates with them. And usually there's at least 1 or 2 that are wrong. So when I took this test, I came up as ESTJ. And even the career counselor who did that was like, yeah, you're not an S. I'm very up in my head and into abstract things and conceptual things. So you can actually think through each of those domains. So you don't need a test to tell you if you're an introvert or an extrovert because you already know that. And remember, and this is another problem with that model, these traits are in reality normally distributed. So introversion, extroversion, we call that high extroversion versus low extroversion, is actually normally distributed so that most people are in the middle. Most people are ambiverts. There's only a few people out on the tails who are like classic introverts or classic extroverts. So that's another issue. But let's say you really are an extrovert, you will know that, right? You don't really need the test to take it. So you don't really need to fill in the questionnaire to figure that out. So when I think through those, then I know that I'm an N, and yeah, maybe a J. Or if I'm interpreting that domain as openness, I could be a P. If you fall in the middle, what some people do is they'll just put an X there. Okay, so I could say that I'm an ENTX. But what I'm getting with this is that whatever was produced by you answering that test is probably a little off. And so if you read that report and you're like, yeah, that's really not me, think through those types, maybe come up with a different type, go look at that report, and you might get more out of that. The MBTI is commonly used in workplaces for team development. And one of the biggest reasons people use it is because all the reports are flattering. All of those 16 reports sell you on that kind of type. And we see that in the P versus J thing around conscientiousness. The perceiving versus judging taps at the idea. It doesn't map on perfectly, but it maps on mostly. It's the idea of conscientiousness. And other models have a really kind of damning, disparaging way of looking at people with low conscientiousness. But the MBTI would say, well, you're flexible and, you can turn on a dime and maybe you're spontaneous. And it has a more appreciative tone to it. And so it helps people think about differences, and it helps people talk about differences constructively. It helps us appreciate that people who are different from us still make important contributions. Right? So the T's could be a little argumentative, and when they say speak the truth that they see as a fact, well, that could hurt your feelings. But maybe they're a critical thinker, and they could identify problems that help you come up with solutions. So there's a place in the world for that, and the MBTI appreciates that. And I see that kind of orientation lacking in a lot of the other personality models. That said, not a great theory, not a great tool. And that is not what they say, though. So when you go out into the workplace, they'll say, oh, this person is trained and certified by the Myers-Briggs company. And if you go on their website, you'll see all this research. They'll say it's definitely scientifically validated. All that research is funded and published by the company that sells it, and it's not well replicated. I would say that this, just like the star signs, it's valid to the extent that it reflects validated personality constructs. So the whole T versus F thing is useful to the extent that it gets on to disagreeableness versus agreeableness. And then another issue is that matter of the normal distribution. So most people, most of the time, are going to have X's and aren't going to be an extrovert or an introvert. They're in the middle, but there's the typing doesn't accommodate for that. Here is another personality type assessment that you will see in the workplace, and that's called the DISC assessment. And it looks at how people's personalities function to contribute to a team. And so it's based around 4 personality types, and it's based on a book called The Emotions of Normal People from back in 1928. And in that book, Marston theorized that you would express your emotions in one of 4 ways. And we don't believe that anymore. We don't think that there is 4 ways to express your emotions. So one of them is dominance. You're going to take charge and make the decisions. And one of them is influence, which is trying to get people to work together. And another one is just to be supportive and help others achieve goals. And then another one, it could be that you go off independently and produce some correct results. And they're calling that conscientiousness. An issue here is that what people are calling DISC now and what Marston was doing in 1928 have departed. And there was some research on it in industrial psychology in the 1950s, but it's not of any academic interest anymore, though it's quite popular in the marketplace, in the practitioner marketplaces. And there are a bunch of different companies with a bunch of different tests that get at these 4 ideas, but they do it in very different ways. And I sent you guys to a version of the test that I thought was maybe the most useful one, because its 4 ideas were most connected to what I know are validated traits from the Hexaco. But I think the one that's on Open Psychometrics is closest to Marston's theory, and they're quite different. Now, the people that are selling this test will act like it's the greatest thing, and they'll promise you the sun and the moon. Look, you can get trained and certified, and you can use it to hire the right person, and you could train your leaders, and you could build teams, and it will help you with your career. Oh, wow. And it's a lot of BS. Okay? This is a company marketing a product every which way that it can. And there's plenty of companies that do that, even for the MBTI. So when I looked for DISC assessments there, I found totally different questionnaires. So there's one where they'll give you 4 statements. So here's an example. One's, people look up to me. I tend to be a kind person. I accept life as it comes. And people will say I have a strong personality, and you have to pick the one that most represents you and the one that least represents you. So I think, okay, I'll go with strong personality, but I can be quite kind too. So, well, why can't I be both? And people look up to me. Well, what people? And this sort of forces you to go with something, but based on what? So I'm not into that. Really, a good psychometric test question should only assess one thing. Then there's another version of the test there from Open Psychometrics, and this one's probably more like Marston's theory. And you can see here that they're going with one statement. My first reaction to an idea is to see its flaws, and then you're just agreeing or disagreeing with that one statement. These are totally different ways to do assessments. And so when I did both, I came up with totally different results. So one of the tests, the one that I sent you, said that I'm dominant, and yet if you look at the other test, it has dominance as the lowest score. So which is which? And it also produced some boilerplate. So it said, you have a strong inner motivation to influence people and circumstances. Is that true of anyone? I mean, doesn't anyone want to influence other people? You thrive on competitive situations. I certainly do not. Challenging assignments, okay. The stresses and pressures of everyday work and life are unlikely to reduce your effectiveness and enthusiasm. Sure they do. So I don't buy this, but be interesting to know what you think of it. Now I'm going to go back to the narrative stuff, those slides that got lost. I'm going to run back and find them. Okay, so now I'm moving on from type theories to a narrative, social constructivist way of looking at personality. Let's look at personality as character. You act in the world. You undertake actions. So you are an actor. Your actions reflect a social role. Mother, child, boss, worker, nurse. Right now, my actions, right, the way I'm acting, writing stuff on the board, that's for a teacher. That's a social role. And there are social norms and expectations. And you guys have a social role too. You're the students, and you have certain expectations of me as a teacher. So I'm not following a script in that I'm reading line by line, except actually, reading off my slides, I kind of am. But generally speaking in life, you're broadly following a social script. So even though there's no written line by line script for you, I imagine that you are sitting there with your notebooks, taking notes, because it's kind of a student thing to do. And this role serves a social function, and that should serve a social good. There's some reason why we want teachers in the world, and there's some reason why we sometimes take the role of students, and that's to learn things. And these actions take place in a theater, some microcosm. This is like a theater. This classroom is a theater, and this board is a prop. Okay. And what are other theaters? Well, the home that you're in now is a theater. A hospital is a theater. So is your church. So is a campground. And these are all stages where you engage in performances. I'm engaging in a performance right now. And you're other characters, and you're also the audience, and you're judging my performance as good, bad, or decent, or okay. And you're living a story, right? Your own life has a story to it, and your role in the world, who you are in the world, is going to connect to social narratives and cultural myths about what people do. So maybe people can be described like the characters in a story. Maybe there's different kinds of characters. And the Swiss analytical psychologist Carl Jung read many myths and stories from all over the world. And he concluded that there were 12 basic kinds of characters across all these stories. And he thought that these social roles, which follow social scripts, actually belong to some kind of collective human unconscious. Because all cultures have a pretty consistent idea of what a good or a bad mother is like. Right? Like evil stepmothers eat the children. That's the wrong thing to do. We all know that. Jung hypothesized that the characters that we find in stories follow some basic patterns, and that there's about 12 of these prototypical characters, and they have certain goals and methods, certain motivations. So what are they like? Well, there's the caregiver. Maybe that's like a mother who lives a life of family service that provides structure to the life of the child. And there's the king, the boss, the ruler. What does he do? Well, he exercises his control, his dominance to provide a structure to society. And the outlaw leaves his mark by securing the victory of freedom over tyranny. And so are you like one of these? Maybe you're like a few in different contexts. As in my teacher role, I'm on a learning journey with you that's about developing and disseminating knowledge. But I also have a life as a mother. And so that brings me to the idea of persona. So maybe you have one general personality that's similar across different contexts. Okay, I act like an extrovert in most contexts most of the time, but then your life plays out in different theaters. There isn't just one, and so that's a picture of me of a different theater where I have a different role and where I act in ways that are different from this teacher persona that you're used to seeing in this classroom theater. And you too act in different theaters with different roles. And now, go back to the right slide. Okay, now moving on to the idea of personality as traits. And the personality trait theories that we have are based on lexical studies. So we use words to describe people. And Gordon Allport found that there were about 18,000 words that could describe people. I guess he went through the dictionary and just counted the number of words that were descriptions of people. Found about 18,000. You know, words like nasty, nice, smart, generous, helpful, mischievous. But those 18,000 concepts aren't all independent. Lots of them cluster somehow. So saying somebody that's friendly, outgoing, chatty, talkative, gregarious are kind of related. And so are their opposites. If we call somebody quiet, shy, inhibited, retiring, maybe they kind of clump or cluster together into a higher order theme. That's what a factor is. And in this case, the factor would be extrovert. So I described an extroverted kind of traits to you, and I described introverted traits to you. And we don't have to type you and say you're an extrovert or you're an introvert, but we could say, well, you know, this is a trait, and you're on the middle of that distribution, and that's where most people are. It's a different way of looking at personality. Introversion is often misunderstood as sort of shyness, but introverted people often simply seek low levels of stimulation from their environment. Whereas introverts are chronically overstimulated, and research shows that lemon tastes more sour to introverts. They salivate more to the same stimulus. On the other hand, extroverts are people who are chronically understimulated, and they could get sad when they're alone, and they need to go find other people and trouble and get into the middle of all the ruckus in order to feel alive. So a good introversion extroversion question is, if if you're thinking of it as on the tails of the distribution, are you energized by being around other people and all their ruckus, or are you energized by quieter settings? Do you need to like really recover from that kind of thing? If you take a big 5 personality test, which is the most common, the most famous personality model, the one that you learned about in intro psych, it'll give you a profile like this. So this isn't a personality type. What it's doing is giving you a percentile on each of these factors. And in this example, the person is kind of high on extroversion. That looks like it's maybe what, the 80th percentile, which would mean that they're more extroverted than 80% of people. And they're kind of in the middle on openness. So that's average because it's a normal distribution. And in a normal distribution, the mean and the mode are in the middle. And so you can see this is frequency. And I'll draw my axes here. So this is level of the trait. So let's say it's extroversion. So a low level of extroversion or a high level of extroversion. I hope that you can see what I'm drawing. I don't know if you can from the position of camera, and my other camera is not working. And then this is frequency on the y-axis. And so this would be not many people, and that's a lot of people. And the fact that the normal distribution is highest in the middle means that most people fall on the mid-level of the trait. And so it's saying that this person is an average on openness. They're where most people are. But they're below average on neuroticism, which in the big 5 parlance means that they're quite emotionally stable. There is a popular personality test out there called the Star Wars personality test. I had to take it when I was an undergraduate, and I assigned it in my intro psych class. It's actually a measure of the big 5. And so that's my big 5 scores, telling me that I'm about as agreeable as Emperor Palpatine. Oh no! 3rd percentile. So this is the 5-factor model that you would have learned in intro psych and personality classes. I'm not going to test you too hard on this because what I want you to be thinking of is the hexaco. But it has these 5 factors that can be summarized as ocean or canoe. So under openness, we have imagination, artistic appreciation, curiosity, things, what was that on the MBTI? Things that would be the intuitive on the MBTI. Conscientiousness, they see as competence, order, dutifulness, achievement striving, discipline, and deliberation. Extroversion, they have as activity and assertiveness, sensation seeking, gregariousness seems friendliness. But a positive emotion, that means emotions that bring you towards other people, and warmth. And Big 5 and hexaco differ the most on how they see agreeableness, but they see agreeableness as being trust, straightforwardness, altruism, compliance, modesty, and tender-mindedness. And under neuroticism, they have anxiety, anger and hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsiveness, and vulnerability. And isn't it interesting that things that a medical model would say are mental illnesses, anxiety and depression are mental illnesses, this model is saying those are personality traits. We can look at things through different lenses in psychology, right? Maybe you don't have to see that as a mental illness. You can see that as a personality trait. This is from the intro psych textbook I use. And what I want you to notice there is how strong the value judgments are. So somebody who is high on openness is curious, imaginative, independent. That sounds kind of good. I don't know about closed-minded, practical, and conforming. People who are practical and down to earth, I would say, have their place in the world. But that sounds kind of, I don't know, closed-minded. I guess that's another way of saying traditional. What else? So look at how they see high conscientiousness. I see that as efficient, organized, careful. That sounds like someone you want to hire, right? But somebody with low conscientiousness is impulsive, disorganized, and careless. Now, look at how the MBTI looked at that same kind of trait when they did their P versus J dimension. The P sounded kind of good. It sounded like flexible and spontaneous. And so one of the reasons that you can't really use the 5-factor test in a workplace setting is that imagine if you gave people their reports like this and people saw that they were coded or classified as impulsive, disorganized, or careless, or antagonistic, suspicious, and uncooperative. That would not be beneficial as a team development activity, because then you'd be like, ha, yeah, Joey is antagonistic and uncooperative, and that's because he's low on agreeableness, and that's bad. And this is not the way you want to think about personality, though it is the way people think about personality. Look at it; it's in an intro psych textbook. Here's another figure from that same textbook, and you can see the value judgment there. So extroverts are classified as sociable, fun-loving, and affectionate. That sounds great. Let's have that person on the team. And introversion doesn't sound as good, retiring, sober, and reserved. And in fact, there is evidence that in the West, we stigmatize introverts. I don't think that's adaptive. Look at low agreeableness, ruthless, suspicious, and uncooperative. And let's look at high neuroticism, anxious, insecure, and self-pitying. Can you see all the judgment there? Now, that's the big 5, which I know you've all learned in psychology. I want to upgrade you to the hexaco. The hexaco is a 6-factor model. Overall, there's less research on it than the big 5 because it is newer, but the research that's there shows that it has incremental validity over the big 5. That's a better predictor of behavior. And importantly, it covers that dark triad of personality: narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and as low honesty or humility. So the 6th factor is honesty, humility. And what the big 5 does is it lumps that stuff under disagreeableness, but they're in fact orthogonal factors. So the hexaco has a 6th factor of honesty, humility, which pulls some stuff out of disagreeableness on the big 5. And some of the nastier stuff. Another difference is that it takes anger out of the emotionality factor. So under the big 5, tendency to get angry falls under emotionality, and hexaco puts it under agreeableness, particularly under disagreeableness or low agreeableness. And anger is a key emotion for dominance. And I do see socially dominant tendencies as sort of loading onto the low agreeableness versus submissive orientations and behaviors being kind of agreeable and pleasing. So anger is important for dominance, right? So it makes you step forward to take what is yours, makes you assert your boundaries. If you do it well in a controlled way, it's something that makes people respect you rather than exploit you. Okay, so those are the 2 key differences. So there are 6 factors, and we can describe the factor at the domain level. And I'm going to do that for just one of them. Okay, I'm not going to read out all 6. But so let's say look at agreeableness versus disagreeableness. Okay, so person with very high scores on the agreeableness scale forgive the wrongs they suffered, are lenient in judging others, are willing to compromise and cooperate with others, and can easily control their temper. Conversely, people with low scores on that scale hold grudges against those who have harmed them. They remember that and they want to go fix it and make sure you know that that's not okay. They tend to be critical and judgmental, and they're fighters. So they'll stubbornly defend their point of view, and they will feel anger in response to mistreatment. Now, each of the domains has facets. It's the same with the big five. But so if you look at, say, honesty, humility, it breaks down into 4 things. So one of the facets of honesty, humility is sincerity. That's your tendency to be authentic and genuine in interpersonal relations. OD values that. And so low scorers would be willing to flatter others, pretend to like them in order to get what they want. Whereas high scorers would, well, they'd rather piss you off, right? They're not willing to manipulate others. And then they'll take a second facet would be greed avoidance. So people who are low on greed avoidance, right, who are high on greed avoidance, be uninterested in possessing expensive things and showing people that you own these expensive things and have high social status. But low scorers want to enjoy and especially display wealth and privilege. But you could fall in the middle of honesty, humility, because let's say you're very sincere, but you really like expensive stuff. Emotionality has 4 subfacets. So fearfulness, anxiety. What's the difference between fearfulness and anxiety? Anxiety is worrying about things, whereas fearfulness is kind of, it's more about in the moment. Low scores are just sort of are bolder, they're less sensitive to pain, they're tougher, braver, whereas the high scores would want to avoid physical harm. That's not quite the same thing as like kind of worrying about problems. It's more in the moment. Then dependence is your need for emotional support for others. And sentimentality is about your tendency to feel strong emotional bonds with others. Is it easy for you to say goodbye and move on, or does that really pull at your heartstrings? And it's also where you find sort of empathetic sensitivity to the feelings of others. So notice empathy is not under emotionality, is under emotionality, not agreeableness. So you can be disagreeable and care, and you can be agreeable and not care. Extroversion has 4 subfacets. So one of them is your social self-esteem, your tendency to, well, it's about sort of social confidence. I don't really like the concept of self-esteem that much. But if you sort of consider, you have high self-worth and you consider yourself to have likable character qualities, whereas low scorers would sort of have lower self-worth and see themselves as unpopular. I guess the idea there is that if you feel down on yourself, maybe you don't want to engage, or you think other people won't like you. Then some people are bolder. Some people feel more awkward or shy, and other people have no problem with public speaking. That's social boldness. And there's sociability. Some people like going to parties and interacting with others. And there's liveliness, and that's your enthusiasm and energy. Agreeableness has 4 facets as well. So one of them is forgivingness, and it's your willingness to feel trust and liking towards those who have hurt you and wronged you. So the low scorers won't forget somebody that's wronged them, right? They might hold a grudge, they want to go fix that, but high scorers are ready to trust other people again, even if they've harmed them. They're ready to reestablish friendly relations after having been treated badly. And you can see how this is a peacemaking skill, and you can also see how it opens agreeable people to being exploited, because sometimes the person that has hurt you in the past will hurt you again. Then there's gentleness. That's your tendency to be mild and lenient in dealings with other people. So your disagreeable low score tends to be critical, right? If they just don't have a problem with that. And whereas high scorers would be sort of reluctant to judge other people's harshly, and they might be willing to perceive you well or something that you do well, even when maybe they shouldn't. Okay? They might kind of make excuses for you. Then flexibility is your willingness to compromise and cooperate with other people. So your disagreeable person might be a good fit for a courtroom lawyer. They're gonna be stubborn, hold their ground, like to argue. If you are disagreeable, maybe you volunteered for the debate team in high school. But high scorers are conflict avoidant. They avoid arguments and accommodate others' suggestions, even when these may be unreasonable. And that's a major reason why conflict avoidant people, agreeable people, might not work out well in leadership unless they develop assertiveness skills. Because when you say you're a leader and you have power, people are going to come to you and want things from you, and you have to say no, because sometimes they want you to give them a favor that they shouldn't have, and it's not fair to other people. And sometimes they want you to do something unethical, and they'll lead you into that, and you have to say no. Okay, it's being conflict avoidant is, well, yeah. What my academic supervisor says is true, and he says that you can't be a leader if you're conflict avoidant, and I definitely see where he's coming from. Then there's the patience scale, and that's your, doesn't mean quite what you think it means. It means that you have a tendency to remain calm rather than become angry. So it's a quickness to anger concept. So a low scorer will kind of become angry more quickly, whereas a high scorer has a high threshold for feeling or expressing anger. That's interesting. That's not what I would kind of think when you say patience. To me, that's like, oh, I don't mind waiting for the bus. But maybe the impatient person is angry. They're like, where's the damn bus? I've been waiting for 5 minutes. That works. Agreeableness is classically feminine. There are small differences between the sexes, but these differences, sometimes there's small differences, sometimes there's no differences. Whether there's a real difference or perceived differences, these differences get mythologized. Okay? And agreeableness is classically feminine because it's about being soft and yielding and patient and gentle and lenient and forgiving and conflict avoidant. And disagreeableness is classically masculine because it's about being agentic and angry, firm, judgmental, authoritative, argumentative, and law-giving, and going after somebody that crossed the line. But when I've gone out and looked for gender differences in empirical research on the Hexaco, there is none. Okay, so there are disagreeable women and agreeable men. And I was trying to come up with examples, and I couldn't think of any agreeable men. And I asked my friends, and this is what they came up with. They came up with Ned Stark from Game of Thrones, Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad, Neville and Harry Potter, and Peter Parker not in Spider-Man mode. And I have not seen those, or it's been a long time since I have, so I'm trusting my friends on this. I did see Breaking Bad, and Jesse Pinkman kind of he gets used a bit, doesn't he? He gets taken advantage. But he's a nice guy. Then disagreeable women, and it was easy to come up with a couple of examples. Judge Judy, okay, she's pretty critical. You don't get much past her. She'll be like, "That's baloney." And then another example I would say is Dolly Parton. This picture is from a clip from it was maybe a 1970s or 1980s interview with Barbara Walters. And Barbara Walters is asking her really, really insulting questions like, don't you know that people think you're trash? And Dolly is very kind, but she gives Barbara some boundaries, I would say. She holds her ground very well, and she's very self-assured, and she explains that she knows what she wants. So Dolly Parton does not have any kind of a problem with the fact that her wig is fake. She doesn't try to hide that, right? She's not concerned that someone might think that's dumb. She wants what she wants, and then she goes after it. And she doesn't really accommodate any of well, what Barbara Walters trying to put on her. I think that's such a good interview that I'll post it to Brightspace. Previously, I've sort of discussed disagreeableness and has a kind of orientation to social dominance. And I don't think that I was looking at you guys' quiz scores on certain questions that you got wrong. And I thought, oh, I could have explained this better. And there was something that I wanted to add to that. And that's that disagreeableness does not equate to rank or status. Right? I think disagreeableness facilitates socially dominant behavior because you want to be in control. You want at least self-control, maybe control over others. You certainly don't want to be under someone else's control. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily have rank, power, or status. They had a cat picture somewhere here. Here we go. Disagreeable people, cat people are more likely to be disagreeable. And cats are classically disagreeable animals. The cat kind of is self-focused, maybe. Cat kind of does what it wants, and the cat is not concerned with pleasing you. And if you do something that the cat doesn't like, the cat will swat you. Agreeable people are more likely to be dog people. And think about the personality of dog that's really willing to please and wants to do what you want. And have you ever tried putting a cat on a leash? The cat's like, fuck this. But cats don't have any power except that maybe you want to please them. So the cat's on your lap and you're petting it and you can't stand up again. But that comes out of your desire to please the cat, not the fact that the cat, really has any social power. Cats kind of want to be independent. Okay, so disagreeable people may not want power over others. They may not want to be leaders. They may just value freedom. They may want their independence. They may be happier in positions of equality. And if they're also high on humility, then they're not going to be seeking power. And as I explained from the ballroom dance metaphor, taking the social role of the dominance of leading the dance doesn't actually require power. Okay, when you're dancing, and let's say you're dancing with somebody who has the lead role, that person doesn't actually have power over you. They're enacting a social role, and you're going along with it as the follower, but you can stop the dance anytime. Disagreeable people may not have rank. Rank means position in social hierarchy, and higher positions have higher power because they may not have been born into privilege. They might lack other traits or skills that help you climb the ranks. Right? If you're disagreeable, but you're not competent and you don't have high cognitive ability and you have poor social skills, well, then you're probably not going to end up being a leader. And well, maybe if you're the son of the king, you will, but that's different. And they may not have status if they're not respected, say because of what they do or because of their values. On to conscientiousness. So conscientiousness has 4 facets. So one of them is organization. So do you like to seek order in your surroundings, especially your physical surroundings? What does your room look like? What does your desk look like? And then there's diligence, and that's your tendency to work hard. And that's about your work ethic. And it reminds me of the motto of our university, which is age por agis. And that means do what you are doing. Do it well, do it rightly, do it thoroughly, do it to the best of your ability. Do not scatter your moral focus, your moral forces. Do what you are doing. If you're going to do something and what you're doing matters, well, you might as well do it well. Then there's perfectionism, and that is a tendency to be very thorough and very concerned with details. So you want to cross your T's and dot your I's. Where lower scorers are okay with having some errors in their work, but high scorer will go over things with a fine-tooth comb. Then there's the prudence scale, and your prudence is your ability to inhibit your impulses in order to think about what you're doing and take the decide on the action that is the most adaptive and then go do that. So low scorers will act on their feelings and their impulses and maybe not be thinking about the consequences. Last one is openness to experience, and that has 4 subfacets. And there's one of them is aesthetic appreciation. So, you say, wow, that's a beautiful view, and stand there and appreciate that. Well, some people just kind of don't care. They're not going to be all caught up in reading a poem. But high scorers have a strong appreciation of art and the beauty of the world. Then there's inquisitiveness, which is about kind of curiosity and being interested in new experiences. So you're the kind of person that wants to learn about different things. Do you want to go travel and discover new places? Some people don't. And there's creativity. Some people like to innovate and experiment, like to come up with things that are original. Low scorers don't. Low scorers might be more about the traditional ways of doing things. Then there's an unconventionality scale, and that's your interest in and acceptance of the unusual. Some people are really uncomfortable around people who are different, and other people are like, oh, wow, eccentric person, let's get to know them. Okay? And you high scorers might be interested in ideas that seem strange or radical. Oh, wow, isn't that interesting? The hexaco has these value judgments in it too. Like, look at this. I'm just gonna, oh boy, look at agreeableness. It takes all kinds to run a world, but the way they're describing agreeable there is patient, tolerant, peaceful, mild, agreeable, lenient, and gentle. Kind of sounds better than ill-tempered, quarrelsome, stubborn, and choleric. Stubborn is a word that carries a value judgment with it, because what you're talking about there is somebody that's willing to hold their ground. That's a good thing sometimes. And you would want your lawyer to do that if they were fighting for you. You wouldn't want them to just sort of give in and go along with what the prosecution says about you, would you? But I'm seeing here in these write-ups that it looks like we prefer one versus the other. And I want you to be aware of that. That's not an adaptivistic view. So now let's talk about how to interpret your results. When you took the hexaco, you will have seen some graphs. And then if you clicked download the PDF, you would have seen numbers. And so this is what it looked like. And so you will come up with these box plots. And so what you see there are my box plots for agreeableness. And the one in bold is the domain level. And what is that telling you? So remember those scores on the questionnaires went from 1 to 5. Your response options went from 1 to 5. And 1 was strongly disagree, 3 was neutral, and 5 was strongly agree. And they're showing where most people's scores fall. And so the median for agreeableness is a 3. That means most people were selecting neutral on that. And when something's normally distributed, the median and the mean are the same. So the median means the 50th percentile, but that's in the middle, or that's the average on a normal distribution. So the red line is showing you where the median score is, which is probably also the mean. And then there's a box around that, and the box goes from the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile. If your dot falls outside of the box, you really stand out in being much higher than other people or much lower than other people on that trait. So look at your report and look for places where the dot, that's your average score, is falling above or below that box versus in it or right on the line. And what that is telling you is that I'm pretty disagreeable. And that applies to all the different facets for me. givingness, gentleness, flexibility is within the box, but you can see I'm a low scorer there. And I wanted to find one where I had a more average score. So you can see that my organization is pretty much on that red line. So I'm about as organized as your average person. But it says I'm off the charts perfectionist. Okay. So what are the limitations of personality models? Well, you can wonder about culture. So if we have a lexical model that's based on going through a dictionary, did you do that for every language group in the world? If you did it for an English dictionary, was it like the Oxford English Dictionary, or was it the kind of English that they'd speak in the Bahamas? It's probably the Oxford Dictionary, right? And so are we defining personality in the ways that certain cultures define personality? Is there some culture out there that considers a factor of personality that's not one of these 6? Then we can ask, who are these tests normed against? So when I show you these box plots, you see that red line, say that says that a score of 3 is average or typical for agreeableness. Who are those people that produced that average? And I went and looked this up. Okay, I want to answer that question. And I found that like 100,000 people had taken this test. And that red line is like the average, the median of 100,000 people who took the test. Do you think they were randomly selected from across the globe? Are there any people from Trinidad and Tobago there? Are there any people there from Saudi Arabia? Well, no. Okay. These are undergraduates. So it's based on people who went on the internet and submitted the scores just like you did. And who are you guys? You're undergraduates. They're being sent there by your professors. And then they had another sample that was a non-internet sample. And since the authors of this test are professors at, I think, the University of Calgary, well, it's based on undergraduates at the University of Calgary who are probably getting one of those, credit points for participating in a study. So when you look at this, you think that you're comparing yourself against the average global human or all of humanity, and you're not. Okay? You're comparing yourself to other undergraduates. And how representative are undergraduates of people in the whole world? And they're really not, right? They're a very privileged group that is above average in cognitive ability. And these are probably mostly white people, right, who are probably around the age of 20. So that's something to keep in mind. And then think of all the other ways we could have answered that question. Who am I? Okay, only 2 of us were participating in that, but when I've done this with larger classes, people will come up with things like, they'll say, I'm a Christian. Well, if I know that you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, that tells me a lot about you that I'm not going to get from a personality test that might matter to the decisions you make in the world. And people have talked about their sexuality. If you're gay or lesbian or transgender, that might have a lot to do with the way you show up in the world. What about your interests, right? Our student on Zoom here, you told me what you're interested in. You're interested in learning. That's not there, is it? It doesn't tell you about your values or your virtues. It doesn't tell us about your skills or your talents. And another thing that it underestimates is the power of the environment. Sometimes our behavior is the result of the situation, and some situations are stronger situations. So if let's say that you're at a party and you have all the freedom in the world and you can decide whether to sit on the couch or go talk to somebody. Well, maybe if you're an introvert, you'll stay on the couch. But what if I said, I will give you $1,000 if you talk to 5 people? And then you go talk to 5 people. Well, is that because you're an introvert and an extrovert, or is it because I was offering you $1,000? And what if somebody holds a gun to your head? and tells you to do something, then you do it, not because of your personality, but because of the situation. And we live in systems that have cultures and where we're rewarded for doing certain things and punished for doing others. And well, your personality is your pattern of thinking and feeling and acting, but you live in a culture of the wider society, or there's a culture in your organization, and the culture has norms. And what are those defined as? Norms are defined as shared ideas about how you should think, feel, and behave. So there are norms that are telling you how to think, feel, and behave, and rewarding you for being a certain way and punishing you for being another way. It's not all about your personality. So what is an adaptivistic perspective on personality? Well, these models, except for the MBTI, which I think is the strength of it, tend to construct certain traits as undesirable and certain traits as desirable. But it takes all kinds to make a world, right? Personality traits have adaptive functions. Agreeable people are peacemakers who get along with others and maybe help harmonize. That's an important role in the world. And disagreeable people will be bold and brave and stand up for themselves and others and create structures. We need them too. People with high openness are creative, but people with low openness are keepers of traditions. And traditions are important. And sometimes we do something because it's a tradition because it actually works. What's wrong with appreciating that? Why'd you always have to innovate? Getting things done in groups requires political skills. That's Machiavellianism. That's low honesty, right? That's laughing at someone's bad joke just to sort of grease the wheels. It's actually an important skill. So personality traits can also be framed as skills, and certain situations and contexts call for certain skills. You can even consider them preferences. And we can find environments that suit our preferences and skills. We can apply them prudently. You can also learn new skills. I score high on conscientiousness now, but that took about 10 years of working on it because I had a problem with being really, really disorganized. When I was an undergraduate, I would have my backpack, and then I'd have like 2 other bags. Carrie, you might remember this. And they were just like full of junk. And because I would just like cram everything into my bag, and I was that disorganized. I was so disorganized that I would forget to go to meetings. And I remember there was a day where I like stood a person up for the second time, and I was like so embarrassed. I decided I am going to change. And I had something it was like a syllabus. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to put all these dates in my calendar. And it took me a full day, like a full 8-hour day of work to actually do that, because I kept putting things on the wrong day. And I didn't understand how you set something to repeat. And it amazes me now that I could have spent all day doing that. And I'd go and look at the calendar and be like, no, that's on the wrong day. And okay, I'm not like that anymore, but that's because I developed the skill. And now I'll hear people saying that I'm organized and disciplined, but there was a time that I would like waste the whole day. So you can learn new skills. And we even know from research on personality that it does tend to change over time, right? Over time, people get more introverted. And that reminds me that I think there was a slide on lifespan development. It's one of those days. Here we go. So you might remember this from intro psych. That was a long time ago for you. But this is another personality theory that sees people as actors, but our roles change as we get older. So what's your social role when you're an adolescent? Well, you're trying to figure yourself out. Okay? And what are you doing when you're a young adult? Maybe you're trying to find that special somebody and start a family with them. And maybe in midlife, you're focused on your career and raising your family. And maybe at the end of it all, it's your role is to try to make sense of it and see if it was all worthwhile, and then pass that along to others. And so what does personality research say? Well, when you're younger, people tend to be more extroverted because there's an expansive phase of life where you're trying out new things and you're trying to make friends and you're meeting different people and you're going out to the bar and trying to meet somebody there. And then there comes a part of life when you kind of figure out who you are and you have your key relationships and you just kind of want to focus on those. So people get more introverted as they get older. And, maybe when you're 30, you're kind of not that interested in going out to the bar again. So it changes over time as our social roles and as our needs change. My final point is on sort of science and pseudoscience and validity, because there are a few, sorry, this stopped working. We've seen some tools that aren't really valid or reliable, but they can still have some value. So while I know that the star signs aren't a validated model of personality, learn something from it. Other ones you'll see are Enneagram and the sort of 4 colors. And I don't think we had time to talk about it, but the 4 colored ones divides people up into things that you'll recognize from the hexagon. So their idea of a fiery red person is competitive, demanding, determined, strong-willed, and purposeful. And that sounds a bit like disagreeableness. And what's their green person there? They're caring and encouraging and sharing and patient and relaxed. And it sounds like it has a bit of agreeableness in it. Overall, not a valid or reliable system, but what is it telling you there? That, on a good day, the fiery red person can contribute their strong will and their purpose. But there are times and places when that trait isn't adaptive, where they're being aggressive and controlling and overbearing. So I'm not saying that's a valid model, but you can learn something from it. It can make you go, oh, okay, my traits can be good in some contexts and bad in others. Please be aware when using the big 5, as many people still do, that it confounds honesty and humility with agreeableness. We're used to thinking of somebody that's low on honesty and humility as disagreeable, and someone who's high on honesty and humility, but in fact, that's not the case. And so you can have a person with high honesty and humility who's also disagreeable, and a person who is high on agreeableness and low on honesty and humility. And let me see what time it is. I think we're getting kind of a bit over time. And so I'm not going to go over those in the lecture, but let's just say, please remember that these are different factors. There are other traits outside of personality, other constructs outside of personality that you will find in the workplace and in pop culture that have questionable validity. Maybe they offer you something, but overall pretty sketchy. Those are things like grit, emotional intelligence, multiple intelligences, and learning styles. There's no evidence that people learn better using a certain style, though people have their preferences. Multiple intelligences, no. Intelligence is a general cognitive ability, and multiple intelligence, you hear those like 8 different intelligence, like you can be verbally smart and you can be music smart. Those are actually measuring talents or skills, and I'll talk about that next class. Emotional intelligence is probably the combination of social skills and cognitive ability. So There are a lot of tools out there that will be presented to you as sound science, but they are in fact not. And we call that pseudoscience. And there are some red flags for pseudoscience to watch out for. Often pseudoscience will sound like it comes from authority and it has a lot of status. And I'll give you an example of that with the Enneagram. And this is a book called The Essential Enneagram. And the Enneagram is not validated at all. It's not taken seriously in scientific psychology. But if you look at the book, like you see all this authority and status. It's like, oh, MD, PhD, and from Stanford University. Just because somebody has a PhD or works for a fancy university doesn't mean what they're saying is true. Another one is appeal to ancient wisdom. So what did it say? A centuries-old psychological system with roots in sacred tradition. There's all kinds of really old ideas that are not good ideas or they're not true. Another thing that pseudoscience will do is appeal to ideology or values. Like, let's say something sold as all natural. Well, poison ivy is all natural. Pseudoscience will use a lot of cognitive biases or logical errors. And I copied a page from this, Appendix B, validity of the Enneagram test. And if you read this, it sounds super duper scientific. But if you read it line by line to see what they did, it actually is pretty nonsensical. So they decide that there's these 8 types, and they said, we asked representatives of each type. So how did you decide which type they were in the validation study? You've already decided which type okay, wait. And then they're supposed to read a paragraph about the personality, and they read it and revise it to make sure that it's congruent with their actual experience. Then this goes back to the researchers, and the researchers say, we then reviewed their revisions to ensure that the paragraphs were accurate from a theoretical standpoint. Hey, wait a minute. You corrected their correction so it was back in line with the original theory. Can you see that's circular? Yeah. That's a logical error. So that's circular reasoning. Pseudoscientific theories will have no clear mechanism of action. Explain to me why being born under that constellation that kind of looks like scales, what is the mechanism of action by which that makes you more just? How does that work on a cellular level? What is the force that comes out of those stars? And what does it do in your brain? There's no explanation for that. And pseudoscientific theories are difficult or impossible to falsify. You get a lot of these Barnum statements that are true for anyone. Sometimes the statements are really cryptic. An old love will come back to you. Well, that could kind of mean anything. Does it mean that your first love, your ex-boyfriend, will come back to you? And when will it be? Tomorrow or in 5 years? Or does it mean that you'll pick up an old hobby? You used to love skating, and oh, you went skating again, and an old love came back to you. And pseudoscientific theories will also explain away any failed predictions. And you see in this a lot of some spiritual stuff. So a spiritual leader will make a prophecy, and then that won't happen. But the adherents will be like, oh, well, when you think of it this way, it actually did happen. So let's say that the leader says, and the world will end in 2020. And the world keeps turning. And the adherents might say, well, he predicted COVID. Right? They'll reinterpret it. You see this with astrology when, let's say, you're a Virgo, so we predict that something's going to happen, and then it doesn't. Well, that's because Mercury was in retrograde. You can explain away any time the prediction fails. And then you'll see a lot of lofty language and verbosity and jargon, and it sounds intellectual, so you think it's true, but it's really not. And that's kind of like what I was reading to you, that validation study. It's complete nonsense, but it's like Appendix B validation study, and it uses big words, so you might believe it. All right, thank you for your attention, and thank you for your patience with getting starting late today. Are there any questions or comments about that? Okay, so quiz 5 is due Sunday at, that's an old mistake. It says 11 p.m. It's not, it's actually 11:59 p.m. Again, there's no reading for next class, but I'll send you some career development measures. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording and I'm available for any off the record conversations.